You wake up, grab your phone, and within seconds, you've seen more headlines, outrage, opinions, and noise than someone in the 1800s saw in a month. You haven't even gotten out of bed, but your brain has already been hijacked. Now multiply that by years. What happens to a population when this becomes the norm? When attention is splintered, emotion is weaponized, and complexity is replaced by performance. You'd think more information would make people smarter, sharper, better equipped to think for themselves. But that's not what's happening. We're seeing something strange and dangerous. In a time where knowledge is more accessible than ever, clear thinking is disappearing. And not quietly. It's being replaced by something faster, louder, and more contagious. Mass certainty, blind confidence, shallow takes, outrage in place of analysis. And under the surface, something deeper is eroding. The ability, or maybe even the desire, to think critically at all. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once warned that the ideal subject of a totalitarian regime isn't the fanatic or the loyalist. It's the person who no longer knows the difference between truth and falsehood. Not because they're unintelligent, but because they've stopped caring. But how does that happen? The answer isn't simple. It's not a switch that gets flipped. It's a slow rewiring. You see it in classrooms that reward memorization but punish questioning. In offices where speaking up costs more than staying quiet. In digital platforms that elevate rage and ridicule because they generate more clicks than reason ever could. Every part of the system has been optimized for attention, not understanding. And the result? An environment where thought becomes friction. Let's start with the obvious. We are overwhelmed. According to cognitive neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, the average person now consumes over 34 gigabytes of information per day. That includes texts, posts, emails, videos, ads, alerts. It's constant, and your brain can't process all of it. It starts cutting corners. This isn't just theory. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, identified two modes of thinking. System 1, which is fast, automatic, emotional. And System 2, which is slow, deliberate, logical. System 1 is what you use when you dodge a falling object. System 2 is what you use when you're solving a complex problem or analyzing an argument. But here's the catch. System 2 is tiring. It takes energy. And when you're bombarded all day, your brain stays in System 1, reacting, not reflecting. The more you're exposed to overwhelming stimuli, the more you rely on shortcuts. Gut feelings, social proof, echoes of what you've already heard. That's how collective stupidity starts. Not from ignorance, but from mental exhaustion. And it's being exploited. Let's talk about algorithms. Most people think they're just code, neutral, efficient, optimized. But what are they optimized for? Not truth, not quality, not balance. They're tuned for engagement. And engagement means keeping you angry, distracted, addicted. Platforms learn what makes you react, not what makes you think. They feed you content that confirms your worldview, amplifies your biases, and numbs your ability to tolerate nuance. Over time, your reality becomes a mirror. Everyone agrees with you. Every opinion you see is familiar. The other side? Villains, idiots, brainwashed. And because these platforms reward instant emotional responses, hot takes, clapbacks, identity slogans, the loudest, most simplistic views always rise to the top. Not because they're true, but because they spread. You start seeing the same patterns in public discourse. Debates aren't about ideas anymore. They're about domination, about scoring points in front of a crowd that already agrees with you. Nobody's listening. They're waiting to speak. But this isn't just a tech problem. It starts earlier. John Taylor Gatto, an award-winning educator, argued that modern education wasn't designed to produce independent thinkers. It was modeled after the factory. Timed bells, standardized tests, rigid structure. Its goal wasn't exploration. It was compliance, obedience, predictability. You can see the legacy of that design in how people handle complexity today. When faced with something that challenges their worldview, most don't ask, "Is this true?" They ask, is this safe to believe? And if it's not, if it threatens their tribe, their status, their identity, they reject it, not through analysis, through instinct. The ancient philosopher Plato imagined a cave where people sat facing a wall, watching shadows cast by objects behind them. They believed the shadows were reality because they had never seen anything else. Plato wasn't describing primitive people. He was describing all of us, living in filtered versions of reality, shaped by what we're shown, what we're told, what we want to be true. But the scary part? In today's world, the shadows are algorithmically optimized. They're not just illusions, they're addictive ones. And when everyone's addicted to their own reflection, dialogue dies. Even reading, the most basic tool of reflection, is changing. Studies by neuroscientist Marianne Wolf show that digital media is rewiring our brains for scanning, not comprehension. We skim, we scroll, we swipe. Long-form attention, the kind required for deep understanding, is collapsing. And with it, our ability to process complexity. You've probably felt this. The urge to check your phone mid-article. The mental fatigue when someone explains something that doesn't fit in a headline. The impatience when nuance slows down your certainty. These aren't flaws, they're features. Features of an environment that doesn't just discourage thinking, it punishes it. Because thinking is slow, it requires humility. It means admitting you might be wrong. And in a world where your identity is built around your opinions, being wrong is dangerous. That's why people don't say what they really think. That's why they stay silent when something feels off. That's why they retreat into slogans, reheated opinions, borrowed beliefs. Because thinking is lonely. It means breaking away from the pack. It means not knowing who will follow. Carl Jung warned that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own soul. He wasn't being metaphorical. He meant that people fear introspection. They fear the disruption of comfort, even when comfort is built on lies. It's safer to conform, not just socially, but psychologically. And so, we fall into what Irving Janis called groupthink, where the desire for harmony overrides the need for truth, where smart people stay quiet to avoid conflict, where consensus is chosen over accuracy. And over time, that consensus hardens into orthodoxy. You see this in every system, in politics, in media, in academia. Once an idea becomes sacred, questioning it becomes dangerous. Not because the idea is flawless, but because it's now tied to identity. And when beliefs become identity, disagreement becomes betrayal. And yet, historically, progress has always come from those who refuse to play along. Galileo questioned the church. He was placed under house arrest. Socrates questioned Athens. He was sentenced to death. Nietzsche questioned morality. He died insane and broke. They weren't celebrated in their time. They were inconvenient. They thought too much, spoke too plainly, and society, especially a society in decline, doesn't know what to do with people like that. That hasn't changed. In fact, it may be harder now, because today, the pressure to conform doesn't come from one institution. It comes from everywhere. It comes from the screen in your pocket, the comments under your post, the silence in a meeting, the algorithm that buries dissent, the friend who stops replying, the job you don't get. The signal isn't always loud, but it's clear. Stay in line. And most people do, not because they're weak, but because they're exhausted. Constant noise, constant pressure, constant performance. There's no time left for reflection. And that's the most dangerous part. Because when people stop thinking, they don't stop believing. They just start believing whatever's easiest, whatever's familiar, whatever keeps them safe. And that's how collective stupidity spreads. Not through force, but through fatigue. That fatigue doesn't just dull reasoning. It rewires identity. The moment you stop questioning, something else fills the gap. Certainty. Not the kind built on logic or careful analysis, but the performative kind. The kind that signals loyalty to a group, to a narrative, to an algorithmic feedback loop that's been training you longer than you realize. And here's the problem. Once a belief becomes tied to your identity, it's no longer something you examine. It's something you defend, even against evidence, especially against evidence. This is where manipulation thrives, not by presenting falsehoods, but by creating an environment where the truth becomes irrelevant. What matters is which version of reality gets reinforced the most, which narrative gets repeated, which worldview makes you feel safest, proudest, least alone. That's when something subtle, but profound, happens. You no longer look for what's true. You look for what fits. Even intelligent, educated people fall into this trap, because intelligence isn't immunity. In fact, it can make the trap worse. The smarter you are, the better you become at rationalizing your biases, at defending flawed ideas with sophisticated language, at building intellectual fortresses around beliefs you never truly questioned in the first place. Philosopher Slavoj Žižek once said that ideology is not imposed on us. We enjoy it, we embrace it, because it organizes the chaos. It gives us meaning, identity, purpose, even if it's built on fiction. But this raises a disturbing question. If everyone's stuck in their own curated world, tailored to their comfort, shaped by their fears, who's actually thinking? We tend to assume that thinking is natural, that it comes automatically, but it doesn't. It's a discipline, a skill, a choice. And increasingly, it's a choice people aren't making. Not because they can't, but because the cost is too high. True thinking takes you to uncomfortable places. It means recognizing contradictions in your own beliefs. It means questioning authorities you've trusted. It means accepting that certainty is often a luxury, and sometimes a lie. And when you live in a culture that rewards speed, confidence, and outrage, none of that looks attractive, which is why critical thinking today often looks like weakness. A pause in a debate, a refusal to pick a side, a willingness to say, I don't know. But those aren't signs of confusion. They're signs of depth, of caution, of intellectual honesty, and they're becoming rare. What's common now is performance. Influencers arguing in vertical videos, commentators delivering certainty in 30 seconds or less, schools teaching to the test, news outlets filtering for clicks, people choosing views that align with their community, not with reality. In this environment, doubt is dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it's slow. And when everything is moving faster, slowness is punished. But without slowness, there is no depth. And without depth, there is no thinking, only reaction. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard warned that the crowd is untruth. He meant that truth is not found in numbers or popularity or consensus. It is found in the individual who dares to stand apart, who thinks not for approval, but for understanding. But standing apart is costly. It means losing comfort, losing certainty, losing the feeling of being surrounded by people who agree. That's why the most common reaction to complexity today is retreat. Retreat into group identity, into ideological tribes, into curated digital bubbles, where disagreement is filtered out and dissent is labeled as danger. And this has consequences, not just individually, but structurally. When people stop thinking independently, institutions adapt. They stop aiming for truth and start managing perception. Political platforms cater to feelings, not policy. Media outlets chase clicks, not accuracy. Educational systems reward obedience, not curiosity. And soon, an entire society finds itself optimized for conformity, where complexity is labeled as confusion, where critical voices are treated as threats, where truth becomes whatever survives the news cycle. And by the time anyone notices what's missing, it's too late. This isn't a new pattern. History shows that every time a society devalues thinking, what follows isn't peace, it's decay. Corruption spreads. Decisions become reactive. Fear governs. Power concentrates in the hands of those willing to exploit mental shortcuts. And because nobody's asking questions, nobody sees it coming. It's not always dramatic. Often, it's quiet, subtle. The slow normalization of nonsense, the dulling of discourse, the erosion of shared language. The moment when truth stops being something you search for and becomes something you perform. And here's the final turn. The biggest threat to critical thinking isn't misinformation. It isn't propaganda. It isn't even manipulation. It's comfort. Because the truth is, most people don't want to think deeply. Not because they're lazy, but because it hurts. It reveals contradictions. It creates distance from the crowd. It makes the world messier, not cleaner. It demands responsibility. To think critically is to accept that your beliefs might be wrong, that your heroes might be flawed, that your tribe might be mistaken, that the truth might not be on your side. And in a world where belonging feels like survival, who wants that? So people avoid it. They keep scrolling. They mute the discomfort. They trust the algorithm. They do what feels safe. But that safety comes at a cost. Because when you stop thinking for yourself, someone else will do it for you. Not with a gun to your head, but with a headline, a trend, a filtered feed, a false choice, a half-truth that makes you feel seen. And you'll believe it. Not because it's right, but because it's easy. This is the rise of collective stupidity. Not the absence of intelligence, but the surrender of it. And once that surrender becomes normalized, the damage is hard to reverse. Not because it's permanent, but because it's invisible. People don't realize what they've lost. They think they're informed. They think they're engaged. They think they're thinking. But they're not. They're reacting, echoing, repeating. And worst of all, they're confident. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice, not a collective one, a personal one, to pause, to step back, to resist the pull of certainty, to examine your own beliefs, not to tear them down, but to understand where they came from, to learn how your mind works, what biases shape your thinking, what fears drive your choices, to stop asking, who agrees with me? And start asking, well, what's actually true? Because critical thinking doesn't start with doubt in others. It starts with doubt in yourself. And that kind of thinking, it's not safe. It's not quick. It won't make you popular, but it will make you free. And in a world that rewards obedience, distraction, and noise, that might be the most radical thing you can do.